The fluorescent lights in the Riverside County Family Court cast everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare that seemed to leach the warmth from even the most hopeful faces. Marcus Chen stood outside Courtroom 4B, his weathered hands gripping a manila folder so tightly that his knuckles had gone white beneath skin that bore the subtle scars of a life lived in service to others. The folder contained everything that mattered now, every document that might convince a stranger in black robes that he deserved to keep the most precious thing in his world. Through the reinforced glass of the courtroom door, he could see other families waiting their turn, some clustered together in whispered conversations, others sitting in isolated silence that spoke of battles already lost. The air smelled of industrial disinfectant and the particular brand of anxiety that seemed to permeate every government building he had ever entered. It was a smell that reminded him of military briefings and hospital waiting rooms, places where lives changed direction with the stroke of a pen or the shake of a head. Marcus adjusted his tie for the third time in as many minutes, a navy blue silk that Emma had helped him pick out from the thrift store on Maple Street. She had run her small fingers along the fabric and declared it perfect for convincing a judge that her daddy was the best daddy in the whole world. The tie felt like a lifeline now, a tangible connection to the 80-year-old girl who was sitting somewhere in this maze of corridors with Mrs. Patterson, the court-appointed social worker whose kind eyes couldn't quite hide her professional skepticism. The security guard at the metal detector had been patient with Marcus earlier, watching without comment as he removed his belt, his wallet, his watch, and finally the small hearing aid from his left ear. The device had whistled softly as it passed through the scanner, a sound that made Marcus wince not from pain but from the memory of louder sounds, sounds that had cost him more than just his hearing. He had slipped the aid back into place with practiced efficiency, the familiar weight of it a reminder of distances traveled and prices paid. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Have you ever stood in a place where everything you love hangs in the balance, where the weight of judgment seems to press down on your shoulders like a physical thing? Marcus felt that weight now, settling into his bones with the familiarity of an old companion. He had carried heavier burdens in places far from home, but none had felt more important than this moment, this chance to prove that love could overcome the assumptions that people made about a man who worked nights and spoke softly and wore suits that had been tailored for someone else. The courtroom door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and a bailiff emerged, clipboard in hand, reading names in a voice that carried the authority of routine. Marcus listened as family after family was called, each name a story he would never know, each case a reminder that his situation was not unique in this place where broken families came to be sorted and assigned and sometimes, if they were very lucky, healed. His reflection in the glass showed a man who looked older than his 34 years, with silver threading through black hair that he had cut himself the night before, standing in his small bathroom with scissors that shook slightly in his hands. He had done his best, trimming carefully around the edges, knowing that Emma would notice if he looked anything less than perfect for this day. She had been asleep when he finished, curled up in the bed they shared in their one-bedroom apartment, her breathing soft and even in the way that only children can manage, untroubled by the weight of tomorrow. The suit jacket was a size too large, purchased from the same thrift store as the tie, but it was clean and pressed and the color of charcoal that Emma had declared made him look like a superhero. The pants were hemmed with careful stitches that he had sewn himself, late at night after his shift at the security company, his fingers moving with the same precision that had once guided him through complex translations in languages most people had never heard of. Those same fingers had trembled as he worked, not from fatigue but from the knowledge that every detail mattered, that appearance could tip the scales in a room where justice was supposed to be blind. Marcus had arrived 2 hours early, a habit ingrained by years of military service where being on time meant being late and being early meant being prepared. He had walked the halls of the courthouse, learning the layout, identifying the exits, cataloging the faces of clerks and bailiffs and attorneys who moved through these spaces with the confidence of people who belonged here. He did not belong here, had never wanted to belong here, but circumstances had a way of placing people in situations they never could have imagined. The conversation with his ex-wife played in his mind like a broken record, her voice sharp with frustration and something that might have been genuine concern. She had accused him of being unable to provide stability, of working too many hours, of being too quiet, too withdrawn, too damaged by whatever had happened to him over there. The words had cut deeper than she probably intended, not because they were cruel but because they contained just enough truth to make him question everything he thought he knew about himself as a father. But Emma had never complained about their small apartment or the way he sometimes had to ask her to repeat herself or the fact that their conversations often happened in the peculiar mix of spoken words and hand gestures that they had developed together. She had adapted to his limitations with the remarkable flexibility of childhood, creating a language of love that transcended the barriers that the adult world seemed so determined to erect. When he tucked her in at night, she would trace letters on his palm, spelling out words like love and daddy and forever, her small fingers writing promises that she was too young to understand and too pure to break. The folder in his hands contained character references from his supervisor at the security company, a man who had taken a chance on hiring a veteran whose military records were partially classified and whose hearing required accommodation. There were letters from Emma's teachers, praising her academic performance and her remarkably mature understanding of responsibility. There were medical records that he had finally agreed to release, documents that traced the path from a roadside bomb in Afghanistan to a stateside hospital to a disability rating that defined him in percentages and limitations. Most importantly, there were photographs. Emma blowing out candles on a birthday cake that he had baked himself, the frosting slightly lopsided but her smile radiant. Emma at the zoo, pointing excitedly at elephants while he crouched beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Emma asleep in his lap during a movie, her head nestled against his chest, both of them wrapped in a blanket that she had chosen because it was soft enough for someone who needed extra comfort. The bailiff called another name, and Marcus watched as a nervous young mother gathered her purse and her courage and walked through the doors that would determine the shape of her future. He wondered if she had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, if she had practiced her words in the mirror, if she had children waiting somewhere in the building, counting on her to be strong enough and smart enough and worthy enough to keep them safe. His phone buzzed softly, a text message from his neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez, who had volunteered to be available in case Emma needed anything during the hearing. The message was simple, just a photo of Emma's drawing from that morning, a crayon masterpiece that showed two stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. The taller figure wore what might have been a tie, and the smaller one had yellow hair and a smile that took up half her face. At the bottom, in Emma's careful printing, were the words "My daddy is the best." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that simple declaration, the absolute faith that only a child could possess. Emma had never doubted him, never questioned whether he was enough, never seemed to notice the ways that he fell short of whatever standard the world expected from fathers. She saw him through the lens of love, a perspective that transformed his limitations into quirks and his struggles into stories of bravery that she would whisper to her stuffed animals when she thought he was not listening. The courtroom door opened again, and this time the bailiff's voice carried his name. Marcus Chen. The sound of it in this official space made it seem foreign, as if it belonged to someone else, someone more prepared for this moment. He stood slowly, his knees protesting the long wait, his hands steady now with the calm that came from crossing a threshold from which there was no return. As he walked toward the courtroom, Marcus thought about the letter he had written to Emma the night before, sealed and hidden in his dresser drawer, a message of love and explanation that she might need someday if this day did not go as he hoped. In it, he had tried to explain that love was not always enough, that sometimes good fathers lost their children not because they were not good enough but because the world was complicated and judges were human and systems were imperfect. But he had also written about the privilege of being her father, about the way she had changed him from a broken soldier into a man who understood that the most important battles were fought not with weapons but with patience and bedtime stories and the kind of quiet strength that showed up every day, even when showing up felt impossible. The courtroom was smaller than he had expected, filled with wooden benches that had been worn smooth by countless other people who had sat here hoping for justice or mercy or simply the chance to be heard. Marcus took his seat at the table his attorney had indicated, arranging his folder and his hands and his hopes in the space that had been designated for him in this carefully orchestrated dance of law and emotion. Judge Patricia Brennan entered with the authority of someone who had seen every variation of human failure and triumph, her black robes rustling softly as she took her position behind the bench that elevated her above everyone else in the room. She was younger than Marcus had expected, with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in a style that spoke of efficiency and impatience with anything that wasted her time. The hearing would begin soon, and Marcus would have his chance to speak for himself, to prove that he was more than the sum of his limitations, that he was worthy of the trust that Emma placed in him every night when she fell asleep in his arms. But for now, he sat in the silence before the storm, holding on to the memory of a little girl's drawing and the weight of a father's love that no courtroom could measure or judge could diminish. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to reverberate through Marcus's bones, and Judge Brennan's voice filled the courtroom with the practiced authority of someone who had presided over thousands of cases just like this one. She shuffled through the papers before her with mechanical efficiency, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed the details of Chen versus Chen, another custody dispute in a system overloaded with broken families and impossible decisions. Marcus's attorney. A young public defender named Jennifer Walsh, who carried herself with more confidence than her years might suggest, had warned him that Judge Brennan was known for running a tight courtroom, for her impatience with unprepared litigants and her particular distaste for cases that dragged on longer than necessary. She valued facts over emotion, precedent over sympathy, and had built a reputation for making decisions based on what she called the practical realities of child welfare rather than the romantic notions of parental love. The opposing counsel was everything that Marcus was not. Richard Steinberg wore a suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in 2 months, his silver hair perfectly styled, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of practice in courtrooms exactly like this one. He had been hired by Marcus's ex-wife's new husband, a man who had never met Emma but who apparently believed that his financial resources gave him the right to reshape her life according to his vision of what a proper family should look like. When Judge Brennan called the case to order, Marcus felt his throat constrict with the familiar tightness that came whenever he was forced to speak in formal situations. The acoustics of the courtroom seemed designed to swallow quiet voices, and he had learned through painful experience that his damaged hearing made it difficult for him to gauge the volume of his own speech. What sounded normal to him often registered as barely audible to others, a fact that had caused him embarrassment in job interviews, social situations, and now in the most important conversation of his life. Marcus's ex-wife sat across the aisle, her new husband's hand resting possessively on her shoulder as if to emphasize the stability and security that their combined resources could provide. She had changed since their divorce, her hair styled differently, her clothes more expensive, her entire demeanor reflecting the confidence that came from having moved on to what she clearly considered a better life. When their eyes met briefly across the courtroom divide, Marcus saw not hatred but something worse, a kind of pity that suggested she genuinely believed she was acting in Emma's best interests. Attorney Steinberg rose to present his opening statement with the theatrical flair of someone who understood that family court was as much about performance as it was about law. He painted a picture of instability and inadequacy, describing Marcus's night shift work as evidence of an inability to provide proper supervision, his modest apartment as proof of financial irresponsibility, his quiet demeanor as a sign of social dysfunction that could negatively impact a growing child's development. The attorney's words hung in the air like accusations, each one carefully chosen to chip away at the foundation of Marcus's claim to fatherhood. He spoke of the importance of two-parent households, of the advantages that financial security could provide, of the concerning reports from teachers who had noted Emma's occasional tardiness and her tendency to be overly protective of her father in ways that suggested an inappropriate reversal of parent-child roles. When it came time for Marcus to respond to the allegations, Attorney Walsh gestured for him to stand, and he rose slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for his response, and Marcus opened his mouth to speak, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper that seemed to disappear into the vast space around him. Judge Brennan leaned forward, her brow furrowed with the beginnings of irritation, and cupped her hand to her ear in an exaggerated gesture that made Marcus's face burn with embarrassment. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing the words out with more effort, but the sound that emerged was still too quiet, still insufficient for the demands of this formal proceeding. The judge's expression shifted from confusion to annoyance, and Marcus could see Attorney Steinberg making notes on his legal pad, no doubt preparing to use this moment as further evidence of his client's unfitness for the responsibilities of parenthood. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the whisper of papers being shuffled and the distant sound of traffic outside the courthouse windows. Marcus thought of Emma, probably sitting in a small waiting room somewhere in this building, her legs swinging from a chair that was too tall for her, her hands folded in her lap the way he had taught her when she needed to be patient. She would be wondering what was happening, whether her daddy was being brave enough, whether the judge would understand that he was the best father she could possibly have despite all the ways the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. The weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that his daughter's future hung in the balance of his ability to make himself heard in this room full of strangers, pressed down on him with an intensity that made it even harder to breathe, even harder to find his voice in a place where voice was everything and silence was interpreted as weakness or incompetence or worse. Judge Brennan's patience was clearly wearing thin, and Marcus could see the moment when her professional courtesy began to transform into the kind of judicial irritation that could doom a case before it had truly begun. She had dozens of cases to hear, dozens of families whose lives needed sorting, and she had no time for a petitioner who could not even manage the basic requirement of speaking loudly enough to be heard in her courtroom. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter, the walls seemed to close in, and Marcus felt himself transported back to other moments when his voice had failed him, when the damage done by war had made him seem less than whole in the eyes of people who had never carried the weight of service or sacrifice or the particular kind of courage required to keep going when everything inside you had been broken and carefully pieced back together. The silence stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with tension that seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom. Judge Brennan's fingers drummed against the wooden bench, a rhythmic tapping that counted down the seconds of her diminishing patience. Marcus stood frozen at his table, his mouth dry as desert sand, watching as the woman who held his daughter's future in her hands grew visibly more frustrated with each passing moment of his inability to project his voice beyond the intimate whisper that had become his default since the explosion that had changed everything. Attorney Steinberg seized the moment with the predatory instincts of a lawyer who recognized opportunity when it presented itself. He leaned over to whisper something to Marcus's ex-wife, and she nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose worst suspicions were being confirmed in real time. The new husband, a man whose name Marcus had never bothered to learn, adjusted his expensive watch and looked around the courtroom with the barely concealed impatience of someone accustomed to having his time valued and his presence acknowledged. Marcus's own attorney shot him a look of desperate encouragement, her eyes pleading with him to find whatever voice he possessed and use it before the judge lost what remained of her professional composure. Jennifer Walsh had prepared him for this moment, had practiced with him in her cramped office, coaching him on projection and clarity and the importance of speaking with confidence even when confidence felt like a foreign concept. But practice sessions in empty rooms bore no resemblance to this moment, standing before a judge whose every gesture radiated authority and impatience. The courtroom felt like a theater where he had forgotten all his lines, where the spotlight had found him unprepared and exposed. Marcus could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, from the court reporter whose fingers hovered over her stenotype machine to the bailiff who stood with professional alertness near the door. Even the clerk seemed to be watching, her pen poised above paperwork that would record whatever disaster was about to unfold. Judge Brennan removed her reading glasses and set them down with deliberate precision, the small click of metal against wood echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot. She leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen every variety of human failure and was growing tired of witnessing yet another example of inadequacy masquerading as parental love. The moment stretched beyond uncomfortable into something approaching theatrical absurdity. Marcus opened his mouth again, willing his vocal cords to cooperate, desperate to find the volume that would prove to this room full of strangers that he was capable of advocating for himself and, by extension, for his daughter. But the sound that emerged was barely more substantial than a breath, a ghost of communication that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. That was when Judge Brennan's patience finally snapped. She leaned forward, her hands flat against the bench, her voice cutting through the air with the sharp edge of judicial authority pushed beyond its limits. Her words rang out with crystalline clarity, each syllable designed to carry the weight of command and the sting of public humiliation. "Speak louder," she commanded, her voice filling the courtroom with an authority that left no room for misunderstanding. "I cannot hear you, Mr. Chen, and if you cannot make yourself heard in my courtroom, I have serious doubts about your ability to communicate effectively with your daughter or advocate for her needs in any meaningful way." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. The judge's tone carried not just impatience but a kind of dismissive irritation that reduced him to nothing more than an inconvenience, a waste of valuable court time, a man so fundamentally flawed that he could not manage the basic human function of speaking audibly in a formal setting. Marcus felt his face burn with shame that seemed to radiate from his core outward, heating his skin until he was certain that everyone in the courtroom could see the evidence of his humiliation written across his features. The silence that followed the judge's rebuke was different from the earlier quiet, loaded now with expectation and judgment and the kind of collective held breath that preceded either triumph or complete disaster. Attorney Steinberg made another note on his legal pad, and Marcus could imagine the words being written there, could picture the careful documentation of this moment that would be used to build the case for his unfitness as a parent. The opposing counsel's satisfaction was almost palpable, radiating across the aisle like heat from a fire that was consuming everything Marcus had worked to build since his discharge from the military. His ex-wife shifted in her seat, and for a moment her expression softened with what might have been genuine concern or perhaps just the reflexive sympathy that came from witnessing public humiliation, even when that humiliation served her purposes. She had lived with him long enough to understand that his quiet voice was not a choice but a consequence, though she had never fully grasped the connection between his service and his limitations. The courtroom seemed to spin around Marcus as he stood there, trapped between the impossibility of explaining his situation and the equally impossible demand that he simply speak louder, as if volume were a matter of will rather than physiology. He thought of Emma, probably growing restless in whatever room they had assigned to her, perhaps asking Mrs. Patterson when her daddy would be finished talking to the judge, unaware that her daddy was failing in the most fundamental way possible. The fluorescent lights ABO. V seemed to pulse with his heartbeat, and Marcus felt himself transported back to that day in Afghanistan when the world had exploded in light and sound and chaos, when he had awakened in a military hospital to discover that the blast had taken more than just his hearing. It had taken his confidence, his sense of wholeness, his ability to navigate a world that demanded strength and clarity and the kind of voice that could command attention and respect. Judge Brennan's fingers resumed their drumming against the bench, and Marcus realized that he was standing at the precipice of a moment that would define not just this hearing but the entire trajectory of his relationship with his daughter. He could feel the weight of decision pressing down on him, the knowledge that whatever happened next would determine whether Emma would continue to fall asleep in his arms or whether she would become a stranger whose life he could only observe from the designated distance of court-ordered visitation. The silence stretched beyond uncomfortable into something approaching cruelty, and Marcus understood that this was his moment, his chance to find his voice or lose everything that mattered. The courtroom waited, suspended in anticipation, while a father who had once translated life-and-death communications in a war zone struggled to find the words that might save his most important relationship from the wreckage of misunderstanding and prejudice. The weight of the moment pressed down on Marcus like the desert heat he remembered from deployments that felt like lifetimes ago. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him, waiting for him to comply with Judge Brennan's command or confirm her worst assumptions about his fitness as a father. The silence had become a living thing, hungry and expectant, feeding on his humiliation and growing stronger with each second that passed without the demanded response. Marcus closed his eyes for just a moment, drawing on reserves of courage that he had not accessed since his last day in uniform. When he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted in his bearing. The shame was still there, burning in his chest like shrapnel, but it was joined now by something else, something that had been forged in places where speaking quietly was not a sign of weakness but a necessity for survival. He leaned forward slightly, his hands still gripping the edge of the table, and when he spoke again his voice carried a different quality entirely. It was still quiet, still barely above a whisper, but there was something in it now that commanded attention in ways that volume never could. His words cut through the expectant silence with the precision of a blade drawn by someone who knew exactly how to use it. "Your Honor," he said, and the simple phrase seemed to carry weight far beyond its ordinary meaning. "I cannot speak louder because an improvised explosive device took 40% of my hearing when I was serving as a translator for the United States Army in Afghanistan. I whisper because it is the only way I can be certain that the words I am saying are the words you are hearing." The effect was immediate and profound. Judge Brennan's drumming fingers stopped mid-tap, frozen against the wooden bench as if the motion itself had been interrupted by the sudden shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Her expression transformed from irritation to something approaching shock, her eyes widening as the implications of Marcus's words began to settle into the space between them. Attorney Steinberg's pen stopped moving across his legal pad, the half-formed note abandoned as he processed information that had not appeared in any of the background materials his team had compiled. The confident smile that had been playing at the corners of his mouth disappeared entirely, replaced by the careful neutrality of a lawyer who had just realized that his case might be more complicated than he had anticipated. Marcus's ex-wife sat frozen in her chair, her face cycling through a series of emotions that began with surprise and moved quickly through recognition to something that might have been the first stirring of genuine remorse. Her new husband shifted uncomfortably beside her, his expensive watch suddenly seeming less important than the growing realization that he had dramatically underestimated the man he was trying to remove from his stepdaughter's life. The court reporter's fingers had stilled above her machine, and even the bailiff seemed to have unconsciously straightened, his professional alertness taking on a different quality as he processed the revelation that the quiet man at the defendant's table was not just another struggling single father but a veteran whose sacrifices had been made in service of something larger than himself. Marcus continued, his voice maintaining that same controlled whisper that now seemed less like a limitation and more like a choice made by someone who understood the power of restraint. He spoke of the roadside bomb that had changed everything, of waking up in a military hospital with his ears ringing and his world fundamentally altered, of learning to navigate a civilian life that had no patience for the invisible wounds that war had left behind. The explosion happened during a routine patrol, he said, his words carefully measured and deliberate. I was translating for a village elder who had information about insurgent activity in the area. The bomb was meant for our convoy, but the timing was off. Instead of hitting our vehicles, it detonated as we were walking back from the meeting. 3 soldiers were killed instantly. I was lucky to survive with only hearing damage and a traumatic brain injury that affects my ability to process sound at normal volumes. Judge Brennan leaned back in her chair, her judicial authority momentarily overshadowed by what appeared to be genuine human emotion. The transformation in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the person beneath the robes, someone who was beginning to understand that she had made assumptions about a man whose reality was far more complex than his appearance had suggested. The courtroom had become a different place entirely, the adversarial atmosphere replaced by something approaching reverence. Marcus's whispered revelation had changed the fundamental nature of the proceeding, transforming what had begun as a routine custody dispute into something that felt more like a reckoning with the hidden costs of service and sacrifice. Attorney Walsh sat perfectly still at the table beside him, her earlier anxiety replaced by something that looked like professional satisfaction mixed with genuine respect for her client's courage. She had known about Marcus's military service, had seen the medical records and the disability ratings, but witnessing him find his voice in this moment felt like watching someone claim a strength that the world had tried to take from him. Marcus's hands had stopped trembling, and his posture had changed subtly, no longer the hunched defensive position of someone expecting attack but the straight-backed bearing of a soldier who had remembered his training. The shame was still there, but it was balanced now by something else, by the dignity that came from finally being seen for who he really was rather than who people assumed him to be. When I came home, he continued, his voice steady despite its softness, I learned that the world expects veterans to be loud, to be confident, to take up space in ways that announce our presence and demand respect. But some of us came back different. Some of us came back quiet, not because we are weak but because we learned that the most important conversations happen in whispers, that the most crucial intelligence is shared in voices that cannot be overheard by the wrong people. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet, heavy now with understanding rather than impatience. Judge Brennan's expression had continued to evolve, her professional skepticism giving way to something that looked like the beginning of respect for a man who had found the courage to reveal his vulnerability in service of protecting his relationship with his daughter. The memories came flooding back with the clarity that trauma sometimes preserved, each detail sharp-edged and pristine despite the years that had passed since that dusty morning in Kandahar province. Marcus found himself transported back to a time when his voice had been his most valuable weapon, when his ability to bridge languages and cultures had made the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures, between soldiers coming home and families receiving folded flags. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen H. Had been recruited for the interpreter program not just because of his fluency in Pashto and Dari, but because of an almost supernatural ability to read the subtle inflections and cultural nuances that could mean the difference between truth and deception in conversations where lives hung in the balance. His commanding officers had called it a gift, this capacity to hear not just words but intentions, to catch the hesitation that preceded a lie or the emphasis that revealed hidden meaning. What part of this story resonates most with you? Have you ever had your abilities overlooked because of circumstances beyond your control? Marcus had spent 3 tours in Afghanistan, working with special forces units that relied on his translations to navigate the complex tribal politics and shifting allegiances that defined the region. He had been present at negotiations that prevented bloodshed, had facilitated conversations between American commanders and village elders that had saved countless civilian lives, had served as the crucial link between 2 worlds that seemed perpetually at odds. The village of Kali Zaman had been like dozens of others he had visited during his deployments, a collection of mud brick compounds surrounded by poplar trees and irrigated fields that seemed impossibly green against the brown landscape of the Afghan countryside. The intelligence they had received suggested that the village elder, Haji Abdul Rahman, had information about a planned attack on a nearby forward operating base, intelligence that could save American lives if it could be verified and acted upon quickly. Marcus remembered the weight of his gear as they approached the village that morning, the familiar burden of body armor and equipment that had become a second skin during his years of service. But more than the physical weight, he carried the responsibility of accurate translation, the knowledge that a misunderstood word or missed nuance could have consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate conversation. The meeting had taken place in the elder's compound, a modest room furnished with carpets and cushions where tea was served according to customs that Marcus understood as well as any anthropologist. Haji Abdul Rahman was a man in his 70s, his beard white as mountain snow, his eyes carrying the wisdom and wariness that came from surviving decades of conflict in a region where allegiances shifted like desert sand. The conversation had been delicate, requiring Marcus to navigate not just linguistic differences but cultural sensitivities that could determine whether the elder would share what he knew or retreat into the protective silence that had kept him alive through Soviet occupation, civil war, and now American intervention. Marcus had spoken in the measured tones that showed respect for age and authority, his Pashto flowing with a fluency that had taken years to develop and perfect. The intelligence that Haji Abdul Rahman shared was detailed and specific, describing planned attacks on supply convoys and the locations where improvised explosive devices had been planted along routes that American forces used regularly. The information was valuable enough to save lives, important enough to justify the risk of the meeting, and Marcus had translated each detail with the precision that his training had instilled. It was as they were leaving the compound that everything changed. The bomb had been planted along the path they would take back to their vehicles, positioned with the kind of tactical precision that suggested inside knowledge of their route and timing. The explosion came without warning, a blast of light and sound and searing heat that seemed to tear the world apart at its seams. Marcus remembered the moment of silence that followed the explosion, a strange pause in which his damaged ears registered nothing but a high-pitched ringing that would become his constant companion. He remembered the taste of blood and dust, the weight of debris pressing down on his chest, the disorienting realization that he was still alive when others were not. Private First Class Danny Morrison, barely 19 years old, had been killed instantly, his life ending just months before he was scheduled to return home to a fiancée who was planning their wedding. Sergeant Luis Valdez, a career soldier with 2 children and a wife who sent care packages filled with homemade cookies, had died trying to shield a younger soldier from the blast. Corporal James Wright, who had been accepted to law school and planned to use his military experience to advocate for veterans, had been preparing to take his LSAT when the bomb claimed his future. The guilt that followed Marcus home was as persistent as his damaged hearing, a constant reminder that he had survived when better men had not, that his injuries were visible only to specialists with audiometers and brain scans while their families buried empty caskets and folded flags. The survivor's guilt was a weight that no amount of counseling could fully lift, a burden that shaped every decision he made about how to use the life that had been spared when others had been taken. The traumatic brain injury that accompanied his hearing loss had been subtle but significant, affecting his ability to process multiple sounds simultaneously, making crowded spaces overwhelming and normal conversation volumes painful. The world had become a place of constant noise pollution, where the simple act of speaking at normal volume felt like shouting, where the only peace came in the quiet spaces that most people took for granted. When Marcus had finally been medically discharged, he had carried with him a Purple Heart that felt heavier than all his other gear combined, a disability rating that reduced his service to percentages and limitations, and a profound understanding that the skills that had made him valuable as a soldier were not easily translated to civilian life. The linguistic abilities that had saved lives in Afghanistan meant little to employers who saw only a veteran with hearing problems and a tendency to speak too quietly for their comfort. The irony was not lost on him that his voice, which had once been his greatest asset, had become his greatest liability in a world that equated volume with confidence and silence with weakness. The same careful modulation that had helped him navigate complex cultural negotiations now marked him as someone who lacked the assertiveness that civilian employers expected, someone whose military bearing was interpreted as distance rather than discipline. Judge Brennan's courtroom had become a place where all of these memories converged, where the past and present collided in a moment that would determine whether his sacrifice in service to his country would cost him the most important relationship in his civilian life. The courtroom had settled into a profound quiet that felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that follows revelations that change the fundamental nature of understanding. Judge Brennan's expression had continued to evolve, her judicial mask giving way to something more human, more vulnerable, as she processed the implications of what Marcus had shared. The authority that had seemed so absolute moments before now carried with it a weight of responsibility that she had not expected when she had called this case to order. Attorney Steinberg shuffled through his papers with less confidence than before, searching for legal strategies that had seemed ironclad when his opponent was simply a struggling single father rather than a decorated veteran whose sacrifice had been made in service to his country. The careful narrative he had constructed about Marcus's unfitness as a parent was crumbling in real time, each assumption revealed as prejudice rather than fact, each criticism exposed as a failure to understand the true nature of the man he was trying to discredit. Marcus remained standing at his table, his posture still carrying the subtle discipline that marked him as someone who had served in places where bearing mattered, where the way a soldier carried himself could be the difference between respect and contempt, between mission success and failure. The trembling in his hands had stopped entirely, replaced by the steady calm that came from finally being seen for who he really was rather than who people assumed him to be. It was in this moment of profound quiet that the courtroom doors opened with a soft whisper of hinges, drawing every eye toward the figure who entered with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Colonel Sarah Martinez moved through the space with the purposeful stride of a career military officer, her dress uniform pristine, her silver eagles catching the fluorescent light as she approached the bar that separated the gallery from the proceedings. Judge Brennan looked up with surprise, her eyebrows raised in question as this unexpected arrival disrupted the carefully ordered structure of her courtroom. The colonel's presence was commanding without being aggressive, authoritative without being presumptuous, and she carried with her an air of dignity that seemed to elevate the entire proceeding to a level of importance that it had not possessed moments before. "Your Honor," Colonel Martinez said, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom with the clear projection that came from years of addressing troops in challenging conditions, "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I have information relevant to this proceeding that the court should hear. I served as Staff Sergeant Chen's commanding officer during his final deployment to Afghanistan, and I am here to provide testimony regarding his character and service record." The effect of her words was immediate and profound. Marcus turned toward his former commanding officer with an expression that cycled through surprise, gratitude, and something approaching relief. He had not seen Colonel Martinez since his medical discharge, had not spoken to her since the awkward formality of his final performance review, but her presence in this moment felt like validation from the one institution that had truly understood his worth. Judge Brennan leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful as she considered this unexpected development. The arrival of a colonel in dress uniform was not something that happened in routine custody hearings, and her presence suggested depths to this case that had not been apparent in the paperwork that had crossed the judge's desk that morning. "Colonel Martinez," Judge Brennan said, her voice carrying a new note of respect that had been absent when she had been addressing Marcus, "I will allow you to provide testimony, but I should inform you that this is a civilian custody proceeding, not a military tribunal. Your observations about Sergeant Chen's service record, while undoubtedly valuable, may not be directly relevant to questions of his fitness as a parent. The colonel's smile was slight but confident, the expression of someone who had faced far more challenging audiences than a family court judge and who understood precisely why her testimony would be relevant to the proceedings at hand. She had not come to this courtroom by accident, had not stumbled upon this hearing through coincidence, but had made a deliberate choice to support a soldier whose service had been exemplary and whose transition to civilian life had been marked by the kind of quiet dignity that the world too often failed to recognize or reward. "Your Honor," Colonel Martinez replied, her voice maintaining the respectful but unwavering tone that marked her as someone accustomed to speaking truth to authority. "With respect, I believe that the qualities that made Staff Sergeant Chen an exceptional soldier are precisely the qualities that make him an exceptional father. His service record demonstrates not just courage under fire, but the kind of moral character and protective instinct that are essential to effective parenting." The colonel's presence had transformed the courtroom dynamic entirely, shifting the balance of authority and credibility in ways that Attorney Steinberg was clearly struggling to process. His carefully prepared case had been built on assumptions about Marcus's limitations rather than understanding of his strengths, and the arrival of a uniformed officer who could speak to those strengths with unimpeachable authority was clearly not something for which he had prepared. Marcus's ex-wife shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her expression cycling through emotions that began with surprise and moved towards something that might have been the first stirring of genuine regret. She had lived with Marcus during the early stages of his recovery, had witnessed firsthand the challenges he faced as he adapted to civilian life, but she had never fully understood the context of his service or the magnitude of the sacrifice he had made. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Colonel Martinez continued, turning to address Marcus directly with the kind of acknowledgement that he had not received since leaving the military, saved countless American lives through his work as an interpreter. His linguistic skills and cultural understanding prevented multiple attacks on our forces, and his courage under fire was exemplary. The incident that resulted in his medical discharge occurred while he was protecting intelligence sources who had risked their lives to provide information that would save American soldiers. The colonel's words hung in the air like a benediction, transforming Marcus from a struggling single father into someone whose sacrifice had been made in service of something larger than himself. The context she provided reframed every assumption that had been made about his limitations, revealing them as consequences of heroism rather than evidence of inadequacy. Judge Brennan's expression had continued to evolve throughout the colonel's introduction, her professional skepticism giving way to something approaching awe as she began to understand the true nature of the man who stood before her court. The authority she wielded as a judge seemed suddenly small compared to the moral authority of someone who had served his country with distinction and had paid a price that most people could never fully comprehend. The transformation in the courtroom was complete, the adversarial atmosphere replaced by something approaching reverence for a man whose quiet voice carried with it the weight of genuine heroism and whose claim to fatherhood was supported not just by love but by a demonstrated capacity for the kind of sacrifice that defined true character. Colonel Martinez stepped forward to the witness area with the measured precision that marked every movement of a career military officer, her dress uniform bearing the ribbons and decorations that told the story of a life dedicated to service in some of the most challenging environments on earth. As she raised her right hand to be sworn in, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, understanding instinctively that they were about to hear testimony that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of this proceeding. "Your Honor," Colonel Martinez began, her voice carrying the clear authority that came from years of briefing generals and addressing troops in combat zones, "I had the privilege of serving as Staff Sergeant Chen's commanding officer during Operation Enduring Freedom from 2018 to 2020. During that time, I observed firsthand the qualities that made him not just an exceptional soldier, but the kind of man whose character transcends the circumstances of his service." Judge Brennan leaned forward, her attention completely focused on the colonel's testimony, while Attorney Steinberg appeared to be rapidly reconsidering strategies that had seemed viable before the arrival of this unimpeachable witness. Marcus stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on his former commanding officer with an expression that mixed gratitude with the complex emotions that came from having someone speak publicly about experiences that he had carried in private silence. Staff Sergeant Chen's linguistic abilities were extraordinary, Colonel Martinez continued, but what set him apart was his capacity for cultural understanding that went far beyond mere translation. He did not simply convert words from one language to another, he bridged entire worldviews, helping American forces understand not just what our Afghan partners were saying, but what they meant within the context of their own cultural framework. The colonel's words painted a picture of Marcus that bore little resemblance to the struggling single father that Attorney Steinberg had described in his opening statement. This was a man whose skills had been essential to military operations, whose judgment had been trusted by officers who held the lives of American soldiers in their hands, whose courage had been tested in circumstances that most people could never imagine. How many of you watching have ever felt that your true capabilities were invisible to those who needed to see them most? The colonel's testimony was revealing not just Marcus's military accomplishments, but the devastating irony of a system that had valued his voice when it served military purposes but failed to understand its significance when he needed to advocate for his own family. "I remember one particular incident," Colonel Martinez said, her voice taking on the gravity that came from recounting events where lives had hung in the balance, when Staff Sergeant Chen's cultural sensitivity prevented what could have been a diplomatic catastrophe. "We were negotiating with tribal leaders whose cooperation was essential to our mission, and the initial translations provided by other interpreters had created dangerous misunderstandings that threatened to derail months of careful relationship building." The colonel paused, her eyes finding Marcus across the courtroom, and for a moment the formal structure of the proceedings gave way to something more personal, the acknowledgement between veterans who had shared experiences that civilians could understand only imperfectly. When Marcus was brought into the negotiation, he immediately recognized that the issue was not linguistic but cultural, that certain concepts simply did not translate directly and required explanation rather than mere word substitution. His intervention not only saved the negotiation but actually strengthened our relationship with the tribal leadership, Colonel Martinez continued. The elder specifically requested that he be present at all future meetings, saying that he understood not just their words but their hearts. This kind of cultural intelligence cannot be taught in language schools. It represents a fundamental empathy and understanding that made him invaluable to our mission. The transformation in Judge Brennan's demeanor was unmistakable, her earlier impatience replaced by something approaching reverence for the depth of Marcus's contributions to missions that had protected American lives and advanced American interests in one of the most challenging theaters of modern warfare. The man she had commanded to speak louder was being revealed as someone whose quiet voice had carried enormous influence in contexts where the stakes could not have been higher. Attorney Steinberg made a weak attempt to object to the relevance of military service to civilian parenting, but Judge Brennan overruled him with a firmness that suggested she understood the connection between the character traits that made someone an effective soldier and those that made someone a good father. The colonel's testimony was not just about Marcus's past accomplishments but about the fundamental nature of the man who was fighting for the right to remain in his daughter's life. The incident that result. Ed and Staff Sergeant Chen's medical discharge, Colonel Martinez said, her voice taking on a more solemn tone, occurred during a mission where he had volunteered to accompany a dangerous patrol specifically because his linguistic skills were essential to gathering intelligence that could prevent attacks on American forces. He could have remained at the forward operating base in relative safety, but he chose to expose himself to risk because he understood that his presence could make the difference between mission success and failure. The colonel's description of the bombing that had changed Marcus's life was clinical but powerful, focusing not on the graphic details of injury and death but on the choice that Marcus had made to place himself in harm's way for the benefit of others. She spoke of his behavior in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, how despite his own injuries he had attempted to provide aid to wounded soldiers, how his first concern had been for the men who had died rather than for his own condition. Even in the military hospital, Colonel Martinez continued, while he was recovering from his injuries and learning to adapt to his hearing loss, Staff Sergeant Chen's primary concern was whether he would be able to continue serving, whether his limitations would make him a burden to his unit rather than an asset. It took weeks of counseling to help him understand that his service had been exemplary and that his medical discharge was the result of injury sustained in the line of duty, not a reflection of any personal failure. The colonel's testimony was methodically dismantling every assumption that had been made about Marcus's character and capabilities, revealing him as someone whose quiet voice was not a sign of weakness but a consequence of sacrifice, whose struggles with civilian life were not evidence of inadequacy but proof of the challenges that many veterans faced when transitioning from military service to civilian society. Your Honor, Colonel Martinez concluded, turning to address Judge Brennan directly, the qualities that made Staff Sergeant Chen an exceptional soldier are precisely the qualities that make him an exceptional father. His protective instincts, his cultural sensitivity, his capacity for sacrifice, and his unwavering commitment to those under his care are not diminished by his hearing loss but are actually enhanced by the perspective that comes from having served his country with distinction and having paid a personal price for that service. Colonel Martinez's testimony had created a profound shift in the courtroom atmosphere, but it was Judge Brennan's next question that opened the door to understanding the true heart of Marcus's story. "Your Honor," asked quietly, almost reverently, "how do the protective instincts that Colonel Martinez described manifest in Staff Sergeant Chen's role as a father?" The question hung in the air like an invitation to explore the connection between the soldier who had sacrificed for his country and the father who was fighting for his daughter. Marcus's attorney, Jennifer Walsh, seized this opportunity to present evidence that she had been saving for the right moment. She approached the bench with a folder containing photographs, school reports, and documentation that painted a picture of daily life between a father and daughter whose bond had been forged through shared challenges and quiet triumphs that spoke to the depth of their connection. The first photograph showed Marcus and Emma at her school science fair, both of them crouched beside a volcano model that they had clearly built together. Marcus's hands were positioned protectively near Emma's shoulders as she demonstrated the eruption for judges, his face showing the particular mixture of pride and anxiety that marked parents watching their children perform. What was striking about the image was not just the obvious love between father and daughter, but the way Emma leaned into her father's presence, seeking his steady strength even in her moment of triumph. Jennifer Walsh described how Marcus had adapted his parenting style to accommodate his hearing limitations while still providing Emma with every opportunity to grow and thrive. He had learned sign language not because Emma needed it, but because he wanted to ensure that communication between them would never be hindered by his injury. Their home had become a bilingual space where spoken words were supplemented by gestures and expressions that created a rich vocabulary of love and understanding. The school reports revealed a different story than the one Attorney Steinberg had attempted to construct. While it was true that Emma was occasionally late to school, the tardiness was explained by the extra time Marcus took each morning to ensure that she was properly prepared, that her homework was complete, that she had eaten breakfast and felt confident about the day ahead. His military precision had translated into a parenting style that prioritized thoroughness over speed, quality over convenience. Mrs. Henderson, Emma's third-grade teacher, had provided a written statement that Jennifer Walsh read aloud to the courtroom. "Emma Chen is one of the most responsible and empathetic children I have encountered in my 15 years of teaching. She demonstrates an unusual level of maturity and consideration for others, particularly for classmates who might be struggling or feeling left out. When I asked her about this quality, she told me that her daddy taught her that everyone has invisible battles and that kindness costs nothing but means everything." The teacher's observations revealed how Marcus's own experience with invisible wounds had been transformed into lessons that Emma carried with her into the world. His struggle with being misunderstood because of his quiet voice had become her sensitivity to others who might be overlooked or dismissed. His protective instincts had been channeled into raising a daughter who understood the importance of standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Marcus's work schedule as a night security guard, Wick. Attorney Steinberg had characterized as evidence of his inability to provide proper supervision, was revealed through Jennifer Walsh's presentation to be a carefully considered choice that maximized his time with Emma while still meeting their financial needs. He worked from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, allowing him to be present when Emma woke up, to prepare her breakfast, to walk her to school, and to be available for homework help and bedtime routines. The security company's supervisor had provided testimony about Marcus's exceptional performance in a role that required vigilance, integrity, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. His military training had translated perfectly to civilian security work, and his quiet demeanor was actually an asset in situations where de-escalation was more valuable than confrontation. The night shift suited his hearing limitations, as the reduced ambient noise allowed him to function more effectively than he could during busy daytime hours. Judge Brennan studied the photographs with growing interest, her expression softening as she observed the obvious bond between father and daughter. There was an image of Marcus teaching Emma to ride a bicycle, his hands steady on the seat as she pedaled with determination, her face showing complete trust in his ability to keep her safe. Another showed them at a library, both absorbed in books, Emma's small hand resting on her father's arm as they shared a quiet moment of learning together. The most powerful evidence came in the form of Emma's own artwork, drawings that her teacher had collected over the course of the school year. Each picture told a story of a little girl who saw her father as a hero, not despite his quiet voice but because of the strength and gentleness that voice represented. Her drawings showed a tall figure with kind eyes and strong hands, always positioned protectively near a smaller figure with yellow hair and a bright smile. One drawing in particular captured the courtroom's attention. It showed two figures sitting together on what appeared to be a couch, the larger one's hand resting on the smaller one's head in a gesture of blessing or comfort. At the bottom, in Emma's careful printing, were the words, "My daddy helps me feel safe when I have bad dreams." The image spoke to the fundamental role that Marcus played in his daughter's emotional development, the way his presence provided security and comfort that could not be measured in dollars or volume of voice. Jennifer Walsh presented evidence of Marcus's involvement in every aspect of Emma's education and development. He attended every parent-teacher conference, every school performance, every medical appointment. His calendar was a detailed record of a father who prioritized his daughter's needs above his own convenience, who had structured his entire life around providing her with stability and support despite the challenges posed by his own limitations. The custody evaluator's initial report, which had been somewhat critical of Marcus's living situation and work schedule, was contradicted by more recent observations that painted a picture of a home environment that was modest but loving, structured but flexible, disciplined but warm. Emma's room in their small apartment was filled with books and art supplies, evidence of a father who invested in his daughter's intellectual and creative development even when resources were limited. Marcus had created what the evaluator described as a sanctuary of learning and love, a space where Emma could grow and flourish despite the challenges posed by their circumstances. His military background had provided him with organizational skills that translated into effective household management, and his protective instincts had created an environment where Emma felt secure enough to explore her own potential without fear of judgment or criticism. The evidence painted a picture of fatherhood that transcended conventional measures of success, revealing a relationship built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the kind of quiet strength that had sustained Marcus through military service and now sustained both father and daughter through the complexities of civilian life. The courtroom door opened with a gentle whisper, and Mrs. Patterson, the court-appointed social worker, entered with 80-year-old Emma Chen walking beside her with the careful dignity that children sometimes display when they understand that something very important is happening but are not quite sure what role they are meant to play. Emma wore a blue dress that Marcus had helped her choose that morning, her hair neatly braided in a style that spoke of a father's patient practice with brushes and ribbons and the particular challenges of creating something beautiful from the chaos of a little girl's bedtime hair. Judge Brennan's demeanor softened immediately upon seeing Emma, her judicial authority giving way to the gentler approach that experienced family court judges learned to employ when children became part of proceedings that would determine the shape of their futures. The courtroom, which had been filled with the weight of adult conflict and legal maneuvering, suddenly felt different in the presence of someone whose perspective was unmarked by the complications that made custody battles necessary. Emma's eyes found her father immediately, and the smile that crossed her face was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, pure and uncomplicated and filled with the kind of love that could not be manufactured or coached or influenced by the adult agendas that surrounded her. Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion as he watched his daughter take in the formal courtroom setting, her small hand reaching automatically for Mrs. Patterson's in the way that children seek comfort when faced with unfamiliar situations. Judge Brennan spoke to Emma with the careful kindness that good judges employed when addressing children, explaining that she was not in trouble, that this was simply a conversation to help the court understand what would be best for her future. Emma listened with the serious attention that Marcus had taught her to give to authority figures, her head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that unconsciously mirrored her father's own listening posture. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a series of Emma's writings and drawings from their sessions together, documents that provided insight into the 80-year-old's perspective on her life with her father and her understanding of the changes that might be coming. The social worker explained that children Emma's age were often remarkably perceptive about family dynamics and that their voices, while not determinative in custody decisions, provided valuable insight into the emotional reality of their living situations. The first piece of evidence was a letter that Emma had written to the judge, her careful second-grade handwriting forming words that carried more weight than their simple construction might suggest. Mrs. Patterson read the letter aloud, her voice gentle but clear as she shared Emma's perspective with the courtroom that would determine her future. "Dear Judge," the letter began, "my name is Emma and I am 8 years old. My daddy says you are deciding where I should live and I wanted to tell you about my daddy because maybe you don't know him very good yet. My daddy is the best daddy in the whole world even though he talks quiet. He talks quiet because he got hurt when he was a soldier protecting people like us. When people say he talks too quiet I feel sad because they don't understand that quiet voices can say the most important things." The simple eloquence of Emma's words created a profound silence in the courtroom, her child's perspective cutting through the legal complexities to reach the emotional heart of the matter. Judge Brennan's expression reflected the impact of hearing the case described through the eyes of someone whose future hung in the balance but whose understanding of the situation was unmarked by the bitterness and calculation that characterized adult custody disputes. Emma's letter continued with observations that revealed both her maturity and her deep understanding of her father's character. "My daddy helps me with my homework every night and he never gets mad when I don't understand something. He shows me how to sound out words and he listens to me read stories even when I mess up. When I have bad dreams he sits with me until I feel safe again. He makes the best pancakes and he knows all the words to my favorite songs even though he can't hear them very good." Mrs. Patterson explained that Emma had been remarkably consistent in her descriptions of her life with Marcus, never wavering in her expressions of love and security, never showing signs of the anxiety or conflict that children sometimes displayed when living situations were genuinely problematic. The social worker's professional assessment was that Emma demonstrated exceptional emotional stability and maturity for her age, qualities that reflected the security and guidance provided by her primary caregiver. Judge Brennan asked Emma directly about her understanding of the proceedings, and the little girl's response demonstrated both her comprehension of the situation and her remarkable wisdom about the complexities of adult relationships. She explained that she knew her mommy and her stepdaddy wanted her to live with them, and that they had a bigger house and more money, but that her daddy's house felt like home because love lived there. The most powerful moment came when Emma was asked about her father's quiet voice, the issue that had initiated this entire revelation of Marcus's character and service. Emma's response was delivered with the matter-of-fact clarity that children sometimes brought to questions that adults found complex or troubling. "My daddy's voice is perfect for me," Emma said, her small voice carrying clearly through the courtroom that had fallen completely silent to hear her words. "When he reads me stories at bedtime his voice makes me feel safe. When he sings to me when I'm scared his voice makes the scary things go away. When he tells me he loves me I can hear it even when he whispers because love doesn't need to be loud to be real." The impact of Emma's testimony was immediate and profound. Marcus felt tears threatening as he listened to his daughter articulate concepts about love and communication that most adults struggle to understand. Her words revealed not just her maturity but the depth of their relationship, the way his limitations had become strengths in the context of their shared life. Judge Brennan's questions revealed Emma's understanding of her father's military service, knowledge that had been shared through age-appropriate stories about courage and sacrifice and service to others. Emma spoke with pride about her daddy being a hero, but her definition of heroism was grounded in daily acts of love and protection rather than abstract concepts of military valor. Mrs. Patterson shared additional evidence of Emma's perspective, including drawings that showed her vision of family life with her father. The pictures consistently depicted happiness, security, and love, with no signs of the instability or neglect that might justify removing her from Marcus's care. Emma's art revealed a child who felt protected, valued, and deeply loved by a father whose quiet strength provided exactly the foundation she needed to grow and flourish. The session concluded with Emma's own request to the judge, delivered with the earnest sincerity that only children possessed. She asked simply that she be allowed to stay with her daddy because he needed her just as much as she needed him, because they were a team that worked better together than apart, because love should be more important than money or loud voices or big houses. As Mrs. Patterson led Emma from the courtroom, the little girl turned back to wave at her father, her smile unchanged by the formal proceedings, her confidence in his love unshaken by the complex adult world that sought to measure and evaluate their relationship according to standards that seemed inadequate to capture the reality of their bond. The silence that followed Emma's departure from the courtroom was unlike any that Judge Brennan had experienced in her 15 years on the family court bench. It was a silence heavy with revelation and regret, with the weight of assumptions challenged and prejudices exposed, with the uncomfortable recognition that she had allowed her impatience to cloud her judgment about a man whose quiet voice carried more dignity than all the loud voices that had ever argued before her court. Judge Brennan removed her reading glasses and set them down with deliberate care, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the magnitude of her initial misunderstanding. The man she had commanded to speak louder was not someone who lacked the ability to communicate effectively, but someone whose communication style had been shaped by sacrifice in service to his country, someone whose whispered words carried more weight than the shouted arguments of attorneys who had never risked anything more significant than a lost case. Where in the world are you watching from, and have you ever had to confront your own assumptions about someone based on their appearance or manner of speaking? Judge Brennan was experiencing that confrontation in real time, feeling the uncomfortable weight of judicial authority that had been exercised without adequate understanding, without the patience and wisdom that her position demanded and that Marcus Chen deserved. The transformation in the courtroom atmosphere was palpable as Judge Brennan struggled to find words adequate to address the situation she had created through her hasty judgment. The authority that had seemed so absolute when she had entered the courtroom that morning now felt fragile and provisional, earned through position rather than wisdom, maintained through power rather than understanding. Across the aisle, Marcus's ex-wife sat frozen in her chair, her face cycling through a complex series of emotions as she processed the revelations about the man she had once been married to, the father of her child, the veteran whose sacrifices she had never fully understood or appreciated. The confident certainty that had marked her decision to seek full custody was crumbling as she began to comprehend the depth of her own misunderstanding about the man she had left behind. Sarah Chen had married Marcus when he was still recovering from his injuries, still adapting to civilian life, still struggling with the invisible wounds that made him seem distant and withdrawn rather than heroic and self-sacrificing. She had interpreted his quiet voice as a sign of weakness rather than understanding it as a consequence of his service, had seen his careful routines as obsessive rather than recognizing them as coping mechanisms developed by someone who had learned to function despite significant challenges. The guilt that washed over Sarah was immediate and overwhelming, a recognition that she had abandoned a good man during his most vulnerable period, that she had chosen the security and comfort offered by her new husband over the challenging but ultimately more meaningful relationship she had shared with Marcus. Her new life, which had seemed like such an improvement over the modest existence she had shared with a struggling veteran, suddenly felt shallow and built on foundations that could not bear the weight of genuine scrutiny. Her new husband, Richard Mansfield, shifted uncomfortably beside her, his expensive suit and confident demeanor suddenly seeming less impressive in the presence of Marcus's quiet dignity and demonstrated courage. The financial security and social status that he had offered Sarah as improvements over her life with Marcus now seemed inadequate responses to the fundamental questions about character and sacrifice that the morning's revelations had raised. Attorney Steinberg frantically shuffled through his papers, searching for legal strategies that might salvage a case that had been built on assumptions rather than facts, on prejudice rather than understanding. His carefully constructed narrative about Marcus's unfitness as a parent had been systematically demolished by testimony that revealed not inadequacy but excellence, not weakness but strength, not limitation but the kind of character that transcended circumstances. The lawyer's discomfort was visible as he realized that his aggressive prosecution of this case had placed him in the position of attacking a decorated veteran whose only crime was speaking too quietly for a judge's initial comfort. The professional embarrassment of having his case collapse so completely was compounded by the moral discomfort of recognizing that he had been an unwitting participant in the persecution of someone who deserved recognition rather than criticism. Colonel Martinez remained seated in the gallery, her presence a continuing reminder of the institutional respect and recognition that Marcus had earned through his service, her uniform a visual symbol of values and sacrifice that transcended the petty concerns of custody disputes and financial considerations. Her steady gaze seemed to carry the weight of military justice, a different kind of authority that measured worth through service rather than volume, through character rather than convenience. Judge Brennan finally found her voice, though it emerged with none of the commanding authority that had characterized her earlier pronouncements. "Staff Sergeant Chen," she said, her words careful and deliberate, "I owe you an apology that extends far beyond the normal courtesies of this courtroom. My demand that you speak louder was not just inappropriate but profoundly disrespectful to someone who has earned the right to be heard regardless of the volume of his voice." The judge's acknowledgement of her error was unprecedented in her courtroom experience, a departure from judicial protocol that reflected the extraordinary nature of the morning's revelations. Her apology was not just personal but institutional, and recognition that the system she represented had failed to provide the understanding and respect that veterans deserved when they sought justice in civilian courts. Marcus remained standing at his table, his posture still carrying the discipline that marked him as someone who understood the weight of formal proceedings, but his expression had softened with something that might have been forgiveness, the kind of grace that soldiers sometimes learned in places where holding grudges was a luxury that survival could not afford. The courtroom had become a place of reckoning, where assumptions were being challenged and prejudices confronted, where the comfortable certainties of civilian life were being measured against the harder truths of service and sacrifice. Judge Brennan's transformation was visible in her posture, her expression, her entire approach to the proceeding that had begun as routine business and had become something approaching a moral education. Sarah Chen's tears had begun to fall silently, her recognition of her own mistakes creating a grief that seemed to encompass not just the loss of her relationship with Marcus but the larger loss of understanding about what constituted real strength and genuine character. The man she had left for someone who seemed more successful was being revealed as someone whose success could not be measured in conventional terms but whose worth was beyond question. The morning's revelations had created a situation where the normal adversarial structure of custody proceedings seemed inadequate to address the larger questions about justice, respect, and the recognition that society owed to those who had served with distinction and suffered in silence. Judge Brennan rose from her bench with the slow deliberation of someone who understood that the words she was about to speak would carry weight far beyond the immediate legal proceedings, that this moment would be remembered not just by the participants but by everyone who heard the story of a judge who had learned to listen with more than her ears. The authority of her position had been transformed by the morning's revelations into something deeper and more meaningful, the kind of moral leadership that emerged when legal power aligned with genuine understanding. The courtroom fell into complete silence as Judge Brennan prepared to deliver her verdict, every person present understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when the machinery of justice paused to acknowledge its own limitations and the need for wisdom that transcended legal precedent. The fluorescent lights seemed less harsh, the institutional coldness of the space somehow softened by the human truths that had been revealed within its walls. "Before I render my decision in this custody matter," Judge Brennan began, her voice carrying a gravity that came from genuine humility rather than judicial authority, "I must address the profound disservice I did to Staff Sergeant Chen at the beginning of these proceedings. My command that he speak louder was not just inappropriate but revealed a failure of understanding that this court should never display toward anyone, least of all toward someone who has served our country with such distinction." The judge's words hung in the air like a formal acknowledgement of institutional failure, a recognition that the system designed to protect families and children had nearly failed to recognize the very qualities that made Marcus an exceptional father. Her willingness to acknowledge her error publicly was unprecedented in her courtroom experience, a departure from judicial protocol that reflected the extraordinary nature of the situation. Marcus stood perfectly still, his bearing unchanged by the judge's apology, his quiet dignity intact despite the emotional weight of the morning's proceedings. Colonel Martinez nodded slightly from her position in the gallery, her expression reflecting satisfaction that justice was finally being served to a soldier who had earned recognition rather than criticism, respect rather than dismissal. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Judge Brennan continued, turning to address Marcus directly, "your service to this country has been exemplary, and the sacrifices you have made in that service are evident not just in your military record but in the kind of father you have become. The qualities that made you an exceptional soldier, your protective instincts, your cultural sensitivity, your capacity for sacrifice, and your unwavering commitment to those under your care, are precisely the qualities that make you an exceptional parent." The transformation in Attorney Steinberg's demeanor was complete as he recognized that his case had not just been defeated but had been revealed as fundamentally misconceived from its inception. His expensive suit and confident bearing seemed suddenly inadequate in the face of the moral authority that Marcus had demonstrated simply by being himself, by speaking his truth in the quiet voice that carried more weight than all the legal arguments that had been marshaled against him. Sarah Chen's tears flowed freely now, her recognition of her own mistakes creating a grief that encompassed not just the immediate proceedings but the larger understanding of what she had lost when she had chosen financial security over the deeper values that Marcus represented. Her new husband sat rigidly beside her, his discomfort visible as he processed the reality that his wealth and status were being measured against qualities that money could not purchase. The evidence presented in this case, Judge Brennan said, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm, demonstrates clearly that Emma Chen is thriving in her father's care. The testimony of her teachers, the observations of the social worker, and most importantly, Emma's own words reveal a child who feels loved, protected, and valued by a father who has structured his entire life around her needs and development. If this story has touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from and share your thoughts about the power of quiet strength. Judge Brennan's verdict was becoming more than a legal decision. It was transforming into a statement about the values that society should recognize and honor, about the need to look beyond surface appearances to understand the true character of those who served and sacrificed. The judge's voice took on an even more solemn tone as she addressed the broader implications of the case. This proceeding has reminded me that our courts must be places where service is recognized, where sacrifice is honored, and where the quiet voices of those who have given much for their country are heard with the respect they have earned. Staff Sergeant Chen's voice may be quiet, but his words carry the weight of genuine heroism and demonstrated character. Marcus felt the weight of vindication settling over him like a warm blanket, the recognition he had never sought but desperately needed finally being offered by someone whose opinion carried the force of law. The validation was not just personal but institutional, an acknowledgement that his service had meaning, that his sacrifices had value, that his quiet voice deserved to be heard and respected. Based on all the evidence presented, Judge Brennan declared, her words ringing with finality, I hereby award primary physical custody of Emma Chen to her father, Marcus Chen, with reasonable visitation rights to be arranged with the mother. Furthermore, I am ordering that all legal fees associated with this proceeding be paid by the petitioning party, as this case should never have been brought to trial given the clear evidence of Staff Sergeant Chen's fitness as a parent. The verdict hit the courtroom like a thunderclap, the finality of it settling over the participants with varying degrees of satisfaction and dismay. Marcus felt his knees weaken slightly as the full impact of the decision registered, the knowledge that Emma would remain with him, that their life together could continue, that his quiet voice had finally been heard and validated by the system that had initially dismissed him. Colonel Martinez rose from her seat in the gallery, her movement a gesture of respect for both the verdict and the man who had earned it through service and sacrifice that transcended the immediate circumstances of the custody battle. Her presence throughout the proceedings had provided crucial validation, but the judge's decision represented the civilian recognition that Marcus had never received but had always deserved. But Judge Brennan was not finished. Staff Sergeant Chen, she said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion, I want to thank you for your service to our country and to apologize again for my initial failure to recognize the strength and character that you brought to this courtroom. Your quiet voice has taught us all that true authority comes not from volume but from integrity, not from loudness but from the courage to speak truth regardless of the circumstances. The judge's final words transformed the courtroom from a place of legal proceeding into something approaching a ceremony of recognition, a moment when civilian society acknowledged its debt to those who had served and suffered in its defense. Marcus's vindication was complete, his character validated not just by legal decision but by the moral authority of someone who had learned to listen with wisdom rather than just ears. As the gavel fell for the final time, marking the end of proceedings that had begun with dismissal and ended with recognition, Marcus understood that he had won more than just custody of his daughter. He had won the acknowledgement that his voice, however quiet, carried the weight of genuine heroism and deserved to be heard with the respect that service and sacrifice had earned. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows as Marcus Chen walked down the marble hallway with his daughter's small hand nestled securely in his own, both of them carrying the quiet satisfaction that came from a battle fought with dignity and won through truth rather than volume. Emma skipped slightly beside him, her blue dress swishing with each step, her face radiant with the particular joy that children feel when the adult world has finally aligned with their understanding of what is right and fair. Mrs. Patterson had delivered Emma to the hallway with a smile that spoke of professional satisfaction mixed with genuine happiness for a family whose bond had been tested and proven unbreakable. The social worker's report would reflect not just the legal outcome but the larger lesson about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to understand the true character of those whose lives intersected with the family court system. Colonel Martinez waited near the courthouse entrance, her dress uniform still crisp despite the emotional weight of the morning's proceedings. As Marcus approached, she extended her hand in the formal gesture that marked the respect between soldiers, but her eyes carried the warmth of someone who had witnessed justice served to a man who had earned recognition through service and sacrifice that most civilians could never fully comprehend. "Staff Sergeant Chen," the colonel said, her voice carrying the pride that came from seeing a good soldier vindicated, "you represented yourself and your service with distinction today. Emma is fortunate to have a father who understands that true strength is often quiet, that real courage is demonstrated through daily acts of love and protection rather than loud proclamations of ability." Emma looked up at the colonel with the curiosity that children display when encountering authority figures who clearly respect their parents, her small face reflecting the dawning understanding that her daddy was someone special, someone whose quiet voice carried weight in places where important decisions were made. The recognition that her father was a hero was not new to her, but seeing that recognition reflected in the eyes of others was a gift that would stay with her long after the courthouse doors had closed behind them. As they stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, Marcus felt the weight of vindication settling into his bones, not as burden but as validation of choices made and prices paid in service of something larger than himself. The custody battle was over, but more importantly, his voice had been heard and respected by a system that had initially dismissed him, his character had been recognized by people who mattered, and his relationship with Emma had been protected by the very institutions he had served as a soldier. The courthouse steps were bustling with the usual mix of attorneys and families and court officials, but Marcus and Emma moved through the crowd with the calm that came from having their future secured, their bond validated, their love protected by legal recognition of what Emma had always known to be true. Her daddy was the best daddy in the world, and now everyone else knew it too. Attorney Jennifer Walsh caught up with them near the parking area, her professional satisfaction evident in her smile as she handed Marcus the official custody documents that would ensure Emma remained in his care. The young public defender had learned something important about the clients she represented, about the need to look beyond presenting circumstances to understand the deeper stories of service and sacrifice that shaped the lives of the people who sought her help. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying genuine respect, "it has been an honor to represent you. Your courage in speaking your truth, despite the challenges, reminded everyone in that courtroom about the importance of listening with more than our ears. Emma is lucky to have you as her father, and I believe this case will change how judges and attorneys approach veterans' issues in family court." The drive home was peaceful, Emma chattering excitedly about the judge's kind words and the colonel's impressive uniform, her 80-year-old perspective transforming the morning's drama into an adventure story where her daddy had been the hero and everyone had finally understood what she had always known. Marcus listened with the particular attention that fathers learn to give to their children's observations, finding wisdom in her simple understanding of complex events. Their small apartment had never looked more welcoming than it did that afternoon, the modest rooms filled with the warm light of security and the comfortable clutter of a life built around love rather than luxury. Emma immediately went to her art supplies, announcing her intention to draw a picture of her daddy talking to the judge, her creative interpretation of the morning's events destined to join the collection of artwork that documented their life together. As evening approached, Marcus prepared their dinner with the same careful attention that he brought to all of Emma's care, his movements in the small kitchen reflecting the precision of military training adapted to the tender requirements of fatherhood. The simple meal they shared at their small table felt like a celebration, not just of the day's victory but of the countless quiet moments that had built their relationship into something unbreakable. During Emma's bedtime routine, as Marcus helped her brush her teeth and choose her pajamas and select the book they would read together, the normalcy of their domestic ritual felt precious in a way it had not before the morning's proceedings. The threat of separation had been removed, but more importantly, their way of life had been validated, their quiet routines recognized as the foundation of effective parenting rather than evidence of inadequacy. If this story moved you, Let us know where you're listening from and subscribe for more inspiring stories about the power of quiet strength and the importance of recognizing heroism in unexpected places. The bedtime story that Marcus read to Emma that night was about a little girl whose father was a knight, not the kind who rode horses and carried swords, but the kind who protected people with wisdom and kindness and the courage to speak truth even when his voice was quiet. As Emma drifted off to sleep, her small hand resting in her father's larger one, Marcus reflected on the day's events and the larger lessons they contained about the importance of being heard, about the value of service, about the recognition that strength came in many forms and that the quietest voices sometimes carried the most important messages. The future stretched ahead of them with the security that came from legal protection of their relationship, but more importantly, with the knowledge that Emma would grow up understanding that heroism was not always loud, that courage was often quiet, and that the most important words were sometimes whispered rather than shouted. Their small apartment was filled with love that needed no amplification, with security that required no external validation, with a bond that had been tested and proven unbreakable. Outside their window, the city continued its bustling life, but inside their home, father and daughter rested in the peace that came from knowing they belonged together, that their quiet voices had been heard, and that their love was protected by laws and recognized by institutions that understood, finally, the true meaning of family.